All right, looks like we're live. Let me just fix this up here. I've got like two computers going at once. Hopefully it's not doubling up on the audio. Let me see. Is the audio coming through for those of you guys who are watching? How's the audio doing? Any issues with it? No, seems fine. Or audio good, or is it echoing? Okay, cool. All right, so I'll just start off with the main event, obviously. So we have Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic. Really interesting fight. The way that it ended was a little bad too, because we had an issue where I believe it was the end of the third round, there was an eye poke that Mark Goddard had missed, and I don't necessarily blame him for missing it. He was sort of in an odd position. Sometimes with those, it's hard to tell whether or not the eye poke came through. So for him to say, "Hey, I didn't see it, just keep going," that's okay. Unfortunately, at the end of the round, we saw on the replay that it was clearly a really bad eye poke. So at that point, it's like, okay, well, you probably have to give him a little bit more time there. I kind of wish that at that point there was something in the rules where the commission could have taken a look on the replay, said, "Hey, this was an actual eye poke. Let's give him the 5 minutes," and they actually gave it to him. They didn't. With that being said, if that's not in the rules, then they couldn't have done anything about that tonight. So that's not really an issue that could have been solved. The other way to look at it would be, even if he did get the 5 minutes, he was saying at the end of the fight, which was like 15 minutes after the eye poke, that he still couldn't see. So even if he had the 5 minutes, it would still affect the fight. But even at that point, as far as how to score it, had been tough. I think the first round was a close one. You probably give it to DC, but again, that's a really close round. Second round ended with Stipe almost getting a finish, so Stipe gets the second round. Third round was pretty close. I gave that one to Stipe. So at that point, even prior to the eye poke, Stipe is probably up 2-1. So it's not as though the eye poke changed everything for him. So we got some replay going in the back there. So I'd say, even though that eye poke is going to be something everyone's going to remember, I wouldn't necessarily hold it against Stipe and say that the only reason he won this fight is because of the eye poke. It definitely played a role in it, but I don't think that it was something so large that you have to overlook Stipe's win and take it away from him. But then in the next round, DC did a decent job for someone who couldn't really see out of his right eye. Was able to do okay within striking range. Held his own up against the fence, was trying to give himself as much time as he could to be able to deal with it, but ultimately that wasn't enough for him. Close round, I think in strikes it was pretty even. Some people gave it to Stipe, or some people gave it to DC. I believe the one judge who had it 48-47 probably gave that one to DC. But then fifth round, Stipe does a better job. Lands from a distance, does a decent job of holding DC up against the fence to catch his breath when he needed to. Got a little bit tired at the end there, but did enough to get the win in that round, and ultimately Stipe Miocic wins the fight. As far as where they go from here, DC pretty much is going to be retired. He said the only fight that he's going to take otherwise would be for a title. I don't think anyone's going to give him a title shot. I guess it's always possible with him. If light heavyweight gets to a point where they don't really have a clear contender, or the clear contender is injured, maybe they try to push him in there. Heavyweight, they're going to have to at least run one more fight at heavyweight before DC's name even comes up. I don't know if that's going to happen. I think there's a lot of fights to make at heavyweight. You can do Stipe versus Ngannou, which, by the way, that's going to be tough for Stipe right now. He took a lot of hard shots in this fight, particularly with that right hand. I don't know if he's going to be in a position where a quick fight against Ngannou within like 2 or 3 months is going to be good for him. And sort of like what happened in the first fight, where his chin was a bit compromised after the Ngannou fight, and then DC was able to knock him out. It's possible that he could have a similar issue here with Ngannou, where he had a hard fight with DC. He comes back too soon, and then all of a sudden that's a problem for him. So that's going to be something for Stipe to watch out for. I don't know how quick he's looking to get back, but if I were him, I would not be getting back too soon. As far as how the actual fight went down, for the most part, DC did not do that zombie thing I was talking about. So as we mentioned, when he kind of like reaches forward with his fingers pointed out, which if you're wearing like actual boxing gloves, like it's curled over the top, so it's okay to have your fingers pointed out. When you do that, obviously, if someone tries to come forward, they'll go straight into your fingers, and that'll be a problem. So for the most part, we didn't see that from DC, and I think a big reason why is because Stipe was able to find the body shot around that at the end of the second fight. So for the most part, he wasn't going for that in this fight, and that's a good thing. He was still able to find that left hook a little bit, but it was a much different setup. DC wasn't hanging his arms out, so there wasn't the space underneath to go for the body shot. Was doing a really good job of landing the right hand. Both of them were landing hard right hands. It was just different setups. For Stipe, he's just kind of landing from range, oftentimes trying to throw a jab first to get DC to lean towards the right hand, or he just kind of pivot off to the side and then throw the right hand down at an angle. For DC, he kept finding a home for that right hand off of the clinch. And there were some adjustments that were made by Stipe that were effective. I don't know why he didn't do probably the most basic adjustment to it, though. So when they were in the clinch, he did a good job of like actually like getting wrist control on DC's right hand, so DC couldn't throw that right hand. For the most part, when he was able to get that wrist control, he was fine. He also did a decent job of knowing when that right hand was coming and sort of like shifting out of the way. So if you know a right hand's coming, it's going to be coming from this direction. If you shift that way, that's how you avoid it. If you shift with it, then they'll just kind of adjust it mid-flight and still hit you. So he did a good job of slipping out of the way. But even still, it's not like you can't slip without like having your hand up. Like, you can still slip with your hand up. And for the most part, he was keeping his lead hand down. So even if he'd slip, if he was off timing on it, or if DC was still able to get a quick shot off, his hand would be down. He'd still take a shot to the chin. So as a result, Stipe did take a lot of hard shots there. Was kind of rocked at the end of the first round. I think that's part of the reason why DC probably got that round. But for the most part, made enough adjustments where that shot didn't land enough. And even when it did land, I think he kind of knew it was coming, was a little bit better prepared for it. But even still, DC kept finding an opening for that. DC was lunging forward with his right hand a lot. I think for both of these fighters, what was really odd is that both fighters know that their opponent's looking for the right hand over the top, and that's the shot that they wanted to land to knock each other out. It's the shot that they did land to knock each other out. There was the one from the clinch in the first fight that DC landed on Stipe. In the second fight, everyone remembers the left hooks to the body. That's what drew DC's hands in, but after his hands got drawn in, that's when the right hand came, and that's the one that actually dropped him. So even still, it was kind of surprising to see that Stipe was keeping his left hand down the whole time. There's always room to go over the top. Same with DC. So it was kind of surprising to see all the openings that they had for those right hands, even though both guys knew that the opponent was looking for the right hand. But even still, enough adjustments were made where neither of them was as badly hurt by it as they had been in previous fights. So ultimately, for DC, like I said, he's probably going to be done from here. Maybe they force a title fight at some point, whether it's a fourth fight with Stipe and they try to use the eye poke as a storyline to build into that. Maybe it's a fight with John Jones at some point. But in all likelihood, it seems unlikely. Now, granted, when you're at the championship level of DC, to argue that he deserves a title fight at some point in the future wouldn't be the craziest thing. I mean, we're seeing GSP in the talk right now for the lightweight title when he's never fought a lightweight, or at least hadn't fought in lightweight in over 10 years. I don't remember if he fought a lightweight early in his career or not, but at least in the UFC, it was mostly welterweight and then the short stint at middleweight as well. So it's not impossible for him to get his name in there. For him, the money will probably be great if he takes a title fight. Sounds like he'd be willing to take the fight if it's given to him. So I think he'll take that kind of a fight if it's given to him. But for the most part, I think it's likely that we're not going to see DC again. For Stipe, Ngannou is the guy at heavyweight who deserves the title shot the most. John Jones is trying to steal that title shot right now. Is John Jones going to be successful in stealing that title shot? Maybe. But I don't know. I would like to say for certain that's going to be Francis, but you never know at this point. John Jones had been offered light heavyweight title fight this week. According to some reports I'd seen, he hadn't taken them. Seems like he was waiting on this fight to make his next move. John Jones, if he wants to leapfrog Francis, is he going to be able to? Maybe with the previous negotiation issues, maybe they won't let him, but it's a possibility. So it'll be interesting to see where we go from there. Onto the co-main event, we had Chito Vera versus Sean O'Malley. This was a really weird fight. Another thing that's weird to me is that for whatever reason, it seemed like the announced team was completely oblivious to the fact that O'Malley came in with 2 ankle wraps. I'd have to go back and watch some of his other fights and see if the ankle wraps are a normal thing for him, but that definitely stood out to me right off the bat. Usually if you're wearing ankle wraps, there's a decent reason why, especially if you're wearing 2. Usually that means you have one ankle injury and the other one you're kind of putting on as a decoy. So right off the bat, it kind of looked like there might have been some issue with Sean O'Malley's ankle heading into the fight. It doesn't look like it doesn't look like he threw a kick and got checked, and that was the issue. It looked like he just kind of stepped wrong and he was already injured. So I think he might have been injured going into this fight as it was. Tried to fight through it, tried to wrap up his ankles. I guess the wrap wasn't tight enough, or the injury was bad enough where it didn't really help. But hurt his ankle. For the most part, was having trouble finding his range. Chito Vera did a really good job of keeping his hands up, wasn't really giving O'Malley space to really snipe that right hand. Was throwing kicks from a distance too, so he was just kind of picking them apart from a distance. But it's sort of tough to really gauge this fight because you could tell that O'Malley was probably injured going into it, and he really got hurt even worse pretty quickly in. But ultimately, they get up against the fence. You could tell that Vera was trying to get a finish on him, and to that end, sort of made some mistakes there. Actually, got some really hard right hands from O'Malley, was able to eat him. Fortunately for him, he had a good chin, but O'Malley did land a couple really hard right hands before he got finished. But ultimately, they're up against the fence. O'Malley gets tripped. I wouldn't necessarily got tripped, but he fell over because of his ankle while he was clinched. And then once he went to the ground, Vera followed him, landed a couple of heavy shots on top, and was able to do enough damage where it looked like O'Malley was at least rocked. And at that point, Herb Dean stepped in and stopped the fight. And I think that was a pretty fair stoppage. It didn't seem like O'Malley had any issue with the stoppage either. He was in a lot of pain, so it seemed like a fair time to stop it. So for Sean O'Malley, he loses his O. Not sure whether or not he's going to lose his ranking, especially with it being such a fluky seeming loss for him. For Vera, it should put him in the rankings at this point. I guess at that point you have to question who's going out of the rankings if Vera's coming in it. I don't know if O'Malley's going to be the guy who goes out, but that's a possibility. So moving forward, Chito Vera probably gets another guy who's sort of like in that 12 to maybe 9 range, 12 to 8 range. I'd have to look at the rankings to see who those guys are. That's probably what's next for him. For O'Malley, he's going to need some time to heal up that ankle. I don't know to what degree it's already injured right now. I don't know if he injured it worse, and if so, how bad that is. So at the very least, he's going to need some time to heal up and then eventually get back into fighting or get back into training. It's going to be interesting for him too, because he said that this was the same injury that he had in the Sukumtat fight. So apparently it's an injury that's coming back for him. If you don't have confidence in your ankle, that can definitely limit the types of techniques you like to throw. So for him, I'd be worried that for a guy who likes to throw as many kicks as he does and has a lot of success with those kicks, if he doesn't feel comfortable throwing kicks in the future because he feels like he's going to injure himself or he feels like he's going to re-injure a really weak part of the body, that could really affect how he fights moving forward. The hands are still going to be there. The timing's still going to be there. The accuracy's still there for him, and those are all good things for him. But if you take the kicks away or if you at least limit the kicks because he's uncomfortable about them, that can be a problem. I don't think it's going to be to the same degree as what we've seen with Jose Aldo, where he used to throw leg kicks all the time. And now it seems as though he's really picky with them because he's probably had enough of them checked and hit enough elbows and knees where he's done enough damage to himself. I don't know that we're going to get that level of a drawback on the kicks with Sean O'Malley, but it is going to be something to watch in his next fight. Fight before that was Jairzinho Rozenstruik and Junior Dos Santos. This was a tough fight. It went a little different than I expected. I expected Rozenstruik to hold the center and be pushing Junior Dos Santos back, and instead it was Dos Santos pushing Rozenstruik back. For the most part, it seemed like Rozenstruik's idea was he was going to wait for Dos Santos to come in and pretty much just look to counter Dos Santos. With that being said, it's tough to counter a guy if the guy who you're fighting is just throwing single shots for the most part, especially with all the feints that were in there for JDS. So for Rozenstruik, he was having a hard time because he wanted to counter JDS, but JDS would only commit to one strike and then get out of the pocket. So for Rozenstruik, you're not going to have a long exchange where JDS is going to set his feet where you can counter him. And at the same point, it's not super easy to read what JDS is doing because JDS is throwing a lot of feints. He's throwing different kicks. He's throwing punches to the body, punches to the head. So it made it difficult for him. So for that reason, the fight itself was one of those tense ones, but it wasn't like the most action-packed. There were a couple moments where Rozenstruik tried to blitz forward on JDS if he felt like JDS was sort of caught off guard, like after he caught a kick. He did that in the first round. But for the most part, Rozenstruik was just kind of getting picked apart. And it's one of those things where if you're constantly waiting for your opponent to throw the first shot, they're going to get a few shots here and there where they just like land a soft jab and you block it, but then you're not able to counter. Well, they just scored a point on you and you didn't get a point back on them. So at that point, if you're constantly waiting and you're not the one who's ever initiating, it's going to be difficult if the fight keeps going on, goes through the first round, goes through the second round, and then gets late into the third round where you're probably down in the first 2 rounds and all of a sudden you have to try to rush back at him. And he was putting himself behind in that way. So I think he probably lost the first round. Second round, it was a little tight up until the end when he was able to get his finish, but eventually he was able to start walking down JDS, had him up against the fence. JDS, at that point up against the fence, tries to throw a strike to sort of get Rozenstruik's pressure off of him. And at that point, that's when Rozenstruik's able to come over the top. I believe he landed sort of it was like a pumping jab. It wasn't quite a hook. It was more like a pumping jab. It looked like it hurt JDS on that, but then threw the right hand at the top, and that's what dropped him. And then once he had him down, JDS was just trying to get back to his feet rather than trying to pull him into a guard or trying to just hang on for dear life. And at that point, Rozenstruik's just swinging away, and JDS was unable to fully get back up to his feet and recover. He sort of got up a little bit, but then got knocked back down. And at that point, the ref stepped in and stopped it. A little bit surprised too that JDS, whether or not he'd have been successful with it, I was surprised he didn't really try to mix in any wrestling. Rozenstruik is not a particularly good grappler. JDS has decent wrestling, but on top of that, he's a black belt in jiu-jitsu. It's not as though he's like the slickest black belt, but he's still a very solid grappler. We saw him fight Tai Tuivasa, take Tuivasa down, out-grapple him, and eventually finish him on the ground. I thought that was a possibility for this fight. Again, it's not as though it's always the easiest thing to take it down a 260-pound guy and finish him, but at least having the effort there and at least making that another read that Rozenstruik has to watch for, it was something that I would have liked to have seen. So whatever the case may be, JDS wins the first round, loses the fight. Sort of tough for him. For Rozenstruik, he gets another big win against a top 5 guy. So that'll be useful for him. Tobey Maguire from the first Superman movie or Spider-Man movie. Interesting. Got a little bit more facial hair than that, but yes. So for JDS, tough loss. I think it's three straight for him. I don't know exactly where he's going to go from here. Whether they give him another guy who's in the top 10 or whether they try to give him someone in the 11 to 15 range to get another win. For Rozenstruik, it's sort of tough to tell what they're going to do with the heavyweight division now. I think the idea, assuming that John Jones doesn't come in and shake it up, is you're going to have Stipe versus Francis. You're going to have Curtis Blades. I'm trying to think who Curtis Blades would be fighting. He would be fighting Derek Lewis probably. So at that point, then you have Rozenstruik looking for someone else to fight. They've got Volkov versus Walt Harris. Maybe you give them the winner of that. I don't know if Rosenstrike wants to get a little bit sooner than that, but that's another possibility. Maybe they give him a guy who's lower ranked as well and just keep him busy. But that'll probably be what's next for him. Let me see what the next fight on the card was. Or the fight before that. It was... Oh, yeah, Burns and Pineda. Yeah, so for Herbert Burns and Daniel Pineda, this was a really interesting fight to me because it's one of those... I talk about this specific issue all the time, and it's a really tough one. It's sort of like this tough dichotomy where if you're fighting someone and you know that either a specific technique that they're really good at or a specific area of fighting that they're really good at, sometimes you say, you know what, I'm going to avoid that area at all costs. And sometimes you say, I'm decent at that too. I can probably just hang there and just play it safe, and I can might even be able to beat them in that. So in this case, everyone knows whenever you're fighting Herbert Burns wants the fight to go to the ground. He's not the most technical striker. He's got decent power, so sometimes he can land some hard shots and actually some knockouts. But for the most part, his striking is definitely the biggest weakness in his game. So if you're fighting Herbert Burns, you ideally want to keep it on the feet and beat him in the striking. And Daniel Pineda has a big advantage over Herbert Burns in the striking. So then the question would be, if the fight does go to the ground, are you just like pretending it's hot lava and doing everything you can to get out of there? Or are you going to be like, hey, I've got decent grappling myself. I know that he's probably a little bit better in this area than I am, but I'm still going to try to play it safe. And for Pineda, it seemed as though he decided, you know what, if I do go to the ground with Burns, I'm not going to like pretend it's hot lava and try to get out of there. I'm going to actually be willing to fight him there. Had it not gone well for him, the people would be like, why were you grappling with Herbert Burns? But in this case, it actually did go okay for him, and he was able to do pretty well. So first round, for the most part, landed the better shots on the feet. Ends up getting on top of Herbert Burns after Burns tried to take him down. The announced team was trying to say that Burns had his back. He was behind him, but he never like had both hooks and never really had full back control. So Burns was still trying to establish that, and Pineda was able to escape. But Pineda did get on top. Had really good pressure from top, was able to land some heavy shots, and Burns threw up a couple different submission attempts. At one point was sort of close to starting to lock in a triangle, but wasn't super close on it. Pineda got out. So Pineda definitely won the first round. Second round, Burns had a really nice, I believe it was a right cross right into I'm trying to think if it was a double leg or what takedown it was, but he was able to take him down. Had pretty good pressure from top, had him mounted up against the fence. But then when he was trying to win a scramble, I think he was trying to attack the back. Pineda's went back to the mat, and then Burns tried to switch over to mount, and in that exchange, Pineda ended up coming up on top. But from there, was able to land a bunch of heavy shots again, past Herbert Burns' guard, which was kind of surprising that Herbert Burns wasn't really fighting super hard to keep him in half guard. I guess half guard is a decent ground and pound position, so maybe he thought if Pineda passes, he might have a better chance of escaping from side control. But for whatever reason, that didn't work, or for whatever reason, that was his plan, but it didn't work out for him. Pineda ends up moving to a mounted crucifix, lands a ton of shots. Herbert Burns isn't able to improve position, and the ref steps in, stops the fight, and Daniel Pineda gets the win. So really big for him. I think he had been like 6 or 7 years since he'd last been in the UFC. So really good showing. Not only did he show that he was a better striker than Herbert Burns for the brief period that they had on the feet, but was good enough on the ground to avoid danger with Herbert Burns, got into some tough positions, was able to get out of them, and ultimately was able to do enough to get the win here. First fight on the card, Merab Dvalishvili versus John Dodson. Like I said in the preview, Dodson is a really hard guy to take down and a really hard guy to hold down. So with that being said, Merab's also one of those guys where when he takes guys down, it's not as though he keeps you down. It's not like he's one of those guys where if he gets a takedown in the first 10 seconds of the round, you're staying down for the entire time. You're probably going to come back up. You're probably going to get away. He'll probably take you back down again. You'll come back up. You'll get away. He'll take you down again. And with Dodson, he's a really tough guy to hold down. And for that reason, Merab was having a lot of trouble holding him down. There were a handful of takedowns, but even when he get him, he really didn't do anything on the ground because Dodson would pop back up every time. But for Dodson, it seemed as though he was looking to counter Merab the whole time and was really having a hard time finding his counters. You'd see a lot where it sort of looked like he was staying still, but if you watch his feet, he was really quick to move and shift off an angle. So every time that Merab would come in, he'd try to cut an angle and then look for a counter. But for the most part, he wasn't doing a great job of finding them. And once Merab was able to start taking him down, even though Dodson would get back up, he'd really start respecting that. Then Merab would start throwing up right hands over the top. They'd be landing. It's not as though either of these guys were close to finishing each other. Dodson really didn't get a whole lot of offense off. But for Merab, because he was the one who was actually pushing the offense, because he was the one who was going for the takedowns, because he was mixing the shots or mixing the strikes off of that, he definitely did enough to win that fight. I have a question here. Any news on the O'Malley injury? Also, the 5'8" Vera has longer legs than Stipe. I don't know how true that is because Stipe is 6'5", so that doesn't. I don't think Stipe's torso is that long, but they said it's true. They actually measured it, so I guess I'll take their word for it. It seems a little odd to me, though. I don't really buy it. For O'Malley, I think the O'Malley thing was an ankle injury. He did have his ankles wrapped up beforehand, and when they were showing the replay, it looked as though like his ankle was sort of like bending in. So I think it was an ankle, not a knee, but they didn't really say what it was. He said it was the same thing as the Andre Sukumtov fight, so I'd have to go back and see what the injury was from that. But I do think it's an ankle injury. But again, I'm not sure how injured it was going in because he did have the ankle wraps. So it might have been an injury that he already had. He decided to fight through it, and it just didn't hold up. Or it might just have been a precautionary thing to have the ankle wraps. He might not have been injured and maybe have just injured in the fight. But I do think he probably came in with an injury, given the fact that he had the ankle wraps. So on to the prelims. Vince Pichel versus Jim Miller was the first fight on that. First round went pretty well for Miller. Was doing decent on the feet. Pichel was landing some hard shots as well, especially his right hand. But Miller was able to attack off his back. Had an interesting calf slicer attempt at the end of the first round. I wasn't able to finish. Ran out of time. But in the second round, Pichel started taking Miller down. And again, sort of like I talked about before, where if you know a guy that you're fighting is really good in a specific area, do you avoid it or do you not avoid it? Now, Jim Miller is a very good Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. It's not like he's a Charles Oliveira type where he's like constantly attacking submissions and is constantly catching guys. But he's still a dangerous guy on the ground. And you would have figured that Pichel might have preferred to keep it on the feet, but he was willing to take him down. Was really heavy on top, keeping his shoulders high. Landing pretty good ground and pound, trying to pass to half guard, landing ground and pound from there. It's not like he was ever super close to finishing Jim Miller, but he was doing enough to stay active and to definitely win the round. So he won the second round. Third round, pretty much same approach that he had in the second round and was successful with that. So ends up winning the fight by unanimous decision. Fight before that was, according to how her name is spelled, Vina Jandiroba. They were like Jandirod. I don't even remember how they were pronouncing it. It was bizarre how they were pronouncing it on the broadcast. But either way, as far as how the fight went, Jandiroba shot him for a takedown really quick. Was successful in getting it. Landed in Felice Herrick's half guard. Felice was looking for a half butterfly setup. Sometimes you can get a sweep of that. Sometimes you can do enough to create space and get back up. But really wasn't able to do much with it. So then Jandiroba switched sides and started passing to the other way. So she initially was passing to Herrick's right. Herrick went for the half butterfly with her left leg, went back to like a full guard, and then from there started passing to Herrick's left. Eventually was able to pass the guard, got to mount. Herrick was starting to reach her arms up to try to block punches, and then Jandiroba just scooped up an arm, went for an arm bar. Initially, the arm wasn't straight. It was isolated, but it was sort of like at an angle. But from there, she was able to straighten it out, and then from there, got the tap on it. So really good showing from Jandiroba. She'll be in the top 15, I'm sure, after this, and appears to be the jiu-jitsu girl at 115 right now, especially if Mackenzie Dern isn't fighting at 115. I don't know whether she's doing 115 or 125 right now. It sort of seems like it's a mix between the two for her. Fight before that was Danny Chavez versus TJ Brown. Chavez was surprisingly successful with his leg kick here. Wasn't really setting it up. He was just kind of firing it from the hip. Was still doing a good job of landing it. It was doing a lot of damage to TJ Brown's lead leg. And as a result, Brown, who's normally an orthodox fighter, had to switch to southpaw. Wasn't having a ton of success from there. Occasionally would switch back to orthodox and try to throw a couple of bombs and try to get his finish. But for the most part, wasn't really finding the success he wanted there. Chavez, at least heading into the fight, they were talking about him being like a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and that he'd probably be trying to take this fight to the ground. For the most part, he was finding success with that leg kick. Was doing a good enough job just throwing straight punches to keep TJ Brown at bay. So for the most part, didn't have too many problems here, and he ends up winning a unanimous decision. And then the fight before that was Lavina Souza versus Ashley Yoder. Definitely not the most exciting fight. Souza was having a tough time getting in and actually getting her takedowns. I thought Yoder had done enough to win this fight. I thought it was 29-28 Yoder, but it was a close one. But I did think Yoder had done enough to win. But ultimately, she doesn't get the win, and Souza ends up moving on with a victory. On the early prelims, we had Parker Porter versus Chris Dawkins. Porter, apparently this guy's been at it for like 15 years. I'm not sure exactly what he's been doing in training for all these 15 years. Has some power on his hands, but it's not as though he's like the most technical striker. I'm not sure if he has like decent grappling that we just didn't get to see. But for the most part, it seemed like he was just trying to like pressure on Dawkins, throw looping punches and hope that he could find something to land. Dawkins was a lot crisper with his punches, a lot crisper with his boxing, and ultimately was able to. I'm trying to think if it was like a clinch situation or where it was, but he was able to land a couple short right hands to drop Porter, and then once he got him on the ground, Porter sort of turned away, looking like the fight was probably going to be done anyway as he was turning away. But as he turned away, he turned right into a knee, and that was a pretty vicious finish for Chris Dawkins. And then the fight before that was between Tony Kelly and Kai Kamaka. This was a tough one because Kamaka was going a lot more for power and trying to get top position on the ground, but it's not as though he was super successful once he got on top of like passing guard or really working on a finish, whereas Kelly was just looking to have constant output and just constantly striking the entire time. The final strike counts on this, it's 185 for Kelly versus 138 for Kamaka. Kamaka ends up getting the win by unanimous decision, 3-2. I thought Kelly had done enough, at least in the last 2 rounds, just by being more active to win that fight. But ultimately, the judges didn't see it the same way, so Kamaka gets the win. So that covers it for this card. I'll be doing a podcast tomorrow that'll just cover all the other topics. It'll be previewing next week's card and talking about all the other topics that have come up throughout the week. So that'll be as normal. I don't know whether or not I'll do a stream on it. Initially, I was trying to like run through a streaming software for this rather than just doing a basic webcam thing, but I was having some issues with that. So in all likelihood, it'll just be a regular podcast. I'm not sure if I'll tie in this live stream and have that in the same podcast or if it'll just be topics only. But that'll cover it for this fight card for UFC 252. I'll see if I can make some adjustments here in terms of the live streams. I'm not sure whether or not I'll do these for fight cards or for fight nights, or whether I'll just save them for the pay-per-views. But it was kind of cool to do this. Nice to get some stuff out immediately rather than having to film it at like 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock on a Sunday and then going through all the time that it takes to load up and get the video created and then load the video up. So thank you guys for watching. Glad that you guys enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow with a podcast.